This week we are going to talk about The Godfather Part 2 and about a book that Puzo wrote towards the end of his life, The Last Dawn, which came out in 1996, which was very much a commercial slash artistic operation, an attempt by Puzo to capitalize on the cultish following that The Godfather had garnered through the 1970s and 80s by fabricating a story that was based on the tropes and the cliches of the series. That's why we're going to talk about the film first to establish what the key elements in the Godfather trilogy are, and then look at the novel to identify the recycling and the reproposition of those cliches. I put the schema that you find in week 2 on the board because my intention is to briefly summarize The Godfather Part 2, the story there, the arc of the character of Michael in particular, and then examine both the character of Vito and the character of Michael in those two films, the original Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, to see to what extent this diagram works in furthering our understanding of the failure of Michael in the second film. Okay? So, just a little bit about the production of The Godfather Part 2. December 1971, a few months before the original Godfather came out, Puzo and Coppola started working on the screenplay of The Godfather Part 2. There were several reasons. One is that everyone anticipated this film to be a success, although not as big a success as it actually was. 2, Puzo and Coppola had an idea that made the sequel an intrinsic part of the story. In fact, in the opinion of many, Godfather Part 2 is one of the most accomplished sequels in the history of Hollywood. You know how oftentimes a sequel is an afterthought. Following the success of the first one, lacking any new ideas, Hollywood producers will always fall back to repackaging the narrative and thematic elements of a successful movie to make a sequel. In this case, the original idea by Puzo and Coppola, especially Coppola, was to have a story describing the rise and fall of Michael Corleone and his criminal family as well as his biological family. So this was really the other side of the story. Part 2 was supposed to be the other side of the story. Production, the shooting of the film began in December, October 1973, went on for about 9 months until June 1974, with multiple locations. The film was more complicated. The second part was more complicated than the other. Parts of it were shot in Sicily, but an extensive section of the film. Parts were shot in the Caribbean because a segment of the story takes place in Cuba, and of course, for reasons related to international politics in 1974, it would have been impossible to shoot an American film in Cuba, and then there were scenes in Miami, in Lake Tahoe, in Vegas. Let's talk about the plot. Let me summarize the plot, and of course, you can ask questions or make comments if you're already familiar with the film. My plot will be essential. I will not be going over all of the details in the story. What makes the film The Godfather Part 2 structurally different is the fact that it moves, compared to the first story, in two different temporal chronological directions. There are two narrative lines in the story. One follows the young Vito Andolini before his last name is changed into Corleone, and how he got to the United States, and how he became a criminal first, then the leader of a criminal organization. The second narrative line, related to the years following the first Godfather, is the plans that allowed Michael Corleone to defend successfully against multiple enemies and establish his empire in Las Vegas with hotels and casinos, potentially in Cuba as well, although this doesn't happen because the Batista, dictator of Cuba, who was working with the mafia as a corrupt political leader, allowing them to operate freely with exceptional freedom, Batista was overthrown at the end of 1958 by Fidel Castro, who established a communist regime in Cuba, and therefore both American business companies, legitimate companies, and different mafia organizations quickly lost their investments between 1958 and the early 1960s. The insurrections continued in Cuba for a couple of years until the power of Fidel Castro was solidified. The fact that the film is structured around two narrative lines was considered by the critics of the time when The Godfather came out mostly an inventive thing, a brilliant creative invention. Some of the critics, including influential critics, felt that it made the movie weaker or even more difficult to follow for the spectators. The film was a great success, a commercial success, a success in terms of reviews and accolades. It won 5 or 6 Oscars, with the noticeable exception of Best Actor, which didn't go to Al Pacino, and he received prizes as Best Actor in other contests such as BAFTA, the BAFTA Awards, etc. And certainly the reviews were raving about his interpretation of Michael. So let me add a few more elements to the two storylines. Let's take first Vito Andolini. So at the beginning of the film, right after a brief sequence connecting part 2 to part 1, because we see young Michael having his hand kissed and respect paid to him in his office, which is the continuation of the last scene in the original Godfather. But right after a few seconds of that, and the image of an armchair in his office, which represents the position of leadership, the role of leader of the family, we go straight into the past, where we see the context in which young Vito Andolini, then to be renamed Vito Corleone, operated. Vito has just lost his father, who was killed by the mafia out of perceived disrespect for a local leader. His older brother has left the village to escape assassination and also to plan for revenge, and the funeral of his father is being celebrated with limited attendance by the populace in the village for obvious reasons. During the funeral itself, we hear shots of rifles, presumably, and we see the people scatter, the people in the funeral parade scatter over the Sicilian countryside, and then we see that Vito's older brother was killed. His mother decides to pay a visit to Don Ciccio, the local mafia leader, to beg for his mercy, to convince him that Vito is just a child of 8 or 10 and doesn't represent an immediate danger for him, and also trying to convince him that Vito is dumb, that is not particularly aggressive by nature. That's what she means. And therefore, he should be saved, he should be spared. Don Ciccio doesn't heed to the requests and the prayers of Vito's mother. The mother sacrifices herself to save her kid. She takes Don Ciccio, points a knife at his throat to allow Vito to escape through the countryside, and of course she is killed because Don Ciccio is lives in a compound and is surrounded by bodyguards. Vito hides with the help of relatives and friends, is put on a ship, gets to Ellis Island where he has to undergo quarantine, a very difficult situation, and after that we see a young Vito Corleone played by Robert De Niro, who got the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his role. We see Vito Corleone working in a shop, the shop of Genco Abandando, who will become the consigliere of the family later on. But more things happen in his life to determine his fate and his future in American society. First, he loses his job because Don Fanucci, the representative of the Black Hand in New York City, comes into the shop to ask the shop owner, Genco, to give a job to one of his nephews. And of course, the shop cannot sustain too many assistants, and therefore Vito is fired. Vito has a family to support. He connects in a almost random way with a neighbor who is Clemenza, who asks him to hide a bag, a satchel full of handguns in his house. And through that connection, he starts getting involved with small thefts of clothes that will be sold in the black market. Don Fanucci, the Black Hand Mafia representative, comes to ask for his cut of this business of stolen clothes, And Vito formally agrees to give Fanucci some of the money he is asking, then proceeds to kill Fanucci and establishes his leadership among his accomplices that include both Tessio and Clemenza at this point. Later on in this storyline, we see that Vito is both acting as the protector of the community, helping an older woman avoid eviction from her apartment. He does so reluctantly, as if he cannot really comprehend how fundamental to his role as a leader this will become, but he does that nonetheless, and he does it very professionally, so to speak, very smoothly, right? Not relying on threats of violence or the use of violence. Finally, after we see all the kids of Vito being born, Sonny first, then Fredo, then Michael, Vito will go to Sicily, both to establish a successful olive oil importing business and also to kill Don Ciccio, who's very old at that point. We're in the 1920s. Don Ciccio is very old, unable to really represent any threat, and Vito will have his revenge for the killing of his mother, father, and brother. In the storyline with Michael Corleone, at the beginning of the film, we find another social event, right? They try to repeat a formula that had been successful in the previous film, Coppola and Puzo did. This time, instead of a marriage, it's the celebration of the first communion of Michael and Kay's son, with participation from relatives, friends from New York City, and politicians, higher level politicians this time. The celebration takes place at their villa on the shores of Lake Tahoe. But this time, there isn't so much time between the celebration of a public event involving both the family and the community and the explosion of violence. There was a bit of a buffer in the first film. In the second film, at the end of the day, where the first communion is celebrated, there is an attempt to kill Michael and presumably his wife as well, because they shoot through the windows of their bedroom. So violence very much enters his family life, which prompts a quick reaction from Michael. Michael leaves the house to take care of this issue and entrusts the running of the house, the compound, with bodyguards and his family business in the hands of Tom Hagen, Robert Duvall. In the rest of the film, Michael will deal with two fronts in his war to recover his power. One is New York, where the family has only indirect ties to mafia business through the remnants of the soldiers and the capos they worked with in the first film. The other front is his alliance with Hyman Roth, who represents a famous Jewish mobster by the name of Meyer Lansky, who's trying both to solidify the business of the casinos and hotels in Las Vegas, where in 1958, so Las Vegas is not as developed as it is now. Remember Ocean's 11, which takes place in 1960, for example. And Hyman Roth is also trying to expand the interests of various mafia organizations in Cuba, because there he can count on a strong, close connection with the dictator who would allow them to both invest and recycle big amounts of money. Michael is sure that it was Hyman Roth who sent killers to his compound of Lake Tahoe to kill him and possibly his family. Yet, following his father's advice, keep your friends close and your enemy closer, he continues to do business with Hyman Roth until such time when he can have him killed at an airport and Michael can restore his power. During this storyline, what we see happening in Michael's private life is that Michael becomes more and more isolated. Michael and Kay separate permanently. When Michael is away from the house, Kay, who was pregnant, possibly with a boy, loses her child, and later, during a heated argument between them, we come to know that she had an abortion to stop the cycle of violence being perpetuated from a generation to another, especially through the sons of the family, the same way that it happened to Michael for his own family. Michael and Fredo have a rift because Michael is suspecting and then finds confirmation that the person who allowed the killers into the compound the night of the first communion, and possibly the person who left the curtains of his bedroom open so that the killers could see inside and shoot Michael, was in fact Fredo, and Fredo eventually will be killed. He has contrast with his sister Connie, although Connie agrees to come back and become the woman of the house when Kay is sent away from the house. And Michael will keep the children with Kay visiting, on rare occasion being allowed by Connie to visit briefly. By the end of the film, Michael is alone. He has power, yes, but he has lost the reason for his accumulation of power, which was his own family. And even within his organized crime family, he is gotten more distant, for example, from a key player such as Tom Hagen. Okay? So what produces Michael's failure in part 2 of The Godfather? And if we're talking about failures, we can discuss also Vito Corleone's failure, because we should not forget that at the beginning of the original Godfather, we find Vito Corleone in a position of power, granting the wishes of the people in the community and people in the family like Johnny Fontaine who come asking for favors. But then, after the attempt on his life, even after he comes home, he will never recover his leadership, right? So we have to wonder whether it was just something having to do with his old age and his health after the attempted murder, or something more than that. And what makes Michael a failure in a way that has to do with family more than power, and then, of course, we'll have The Godfather Part 3, the coda, to deal with the loss of power by Michael himself and eventually his own death. let's go back to the schema. So Machiavelli tells us that power is about control, and control is measured by the reaching of desired outcomes. These outcomes should not be simply the reflection of the whims or the personal desires of a leader, whether it be a political leader or the leader of a criminal organization. There should be a necessity to the pursuit of power, so some kind of justification, and then we have to make sure that whatever means were deployed to achieve the outcome, those were the elements that produced the desired outcome, not just the circumstances, not just a stroke of luck. In order to achieve control of a situation, we have two sides. On the material and direct side, we have the use of force or violence, and the threat of the use of force or violence is deterrence, which generates fear. On the immaterial side of the use of power, we have influence, and the major difference between deterrence and influence is that deterrence is still forcing someone to comply under the threat of power, whether or not that threat is overt or implicit. Okay? So, an example of overt threat would be reaching out to an eyewitness or a police officer involved in an investigation or a trial, showing them pictures of their family, which suggests that the family might pay the consequences if they continue with their investigation or if they testify at a trial. No direct threat, no explicit threat is made, but the simple suggestion, the simple presentation of information about the family becomes a way to enforce deterrence. In the case of influence, influence happens through the opposite of fear, happens through love. Influence manifests itself in the voluntary compliance by the people who are subject to the influence. And of course, the dark side of influence is manipulation, where information is either selectively provided to the target of influence or distorted or falsified to produce the same kind of compliance. The easiest example would be someone pretending to be a celebrity. We said natural influence would be a celebrity asking you for a favor, and because you know they are a celebrity, you would be eager to comply. And a common scam is people in our society pretending to be, based on their looks or based on their interpretation and performance, to be a celebrity in order to get favors, a free meal or other kinds of favor, and that would be an example of manipulation. Authority, of course, is another form of influence. In the case of the Godfather, authority comes to the family indirectly through their political connections, their senators, their judges, etc. So, what happens to Vito Corleone according to this schema, right? At the beginning of the first Godfather, we see Vito as a successful leader exactly because he is making a limited, careful, and intentional, calculated use of force, right? We don't see Vito Corleone using force willy-nilly, without reason. And in fact, before the attempt on his life, the only reference to an act of violence would be the order, the instructions given by Vito to Clemenza to have the men who abused the daughter of Buonasera beaten up, right? That's the only reference. We see, on the other hand, plenty of examples of Don Vito's influence. The fact that his marriage is a big social event, and therefore he has clout within the community. He's well connected and loved within the community, and the fact that we know through the details of the marriage that people in positions of power in society, legitimate power, such as senators and judges, have participated or sent their gifts to the married couple of Carlo and Connie. So initially, the success of Vito, his successful leadership, is certainly based on a balance between the use of force and the use of influence. Once Sollozzo comes to talk to Don Vito about borrowing the authority, the connection of the family, to conduct the business of drug trafficking, things precipitate in Don Vito's life and career, right? He is not able to control the situation, for example, by foreseeing that an attack will be brought against him. Yes, we see Don Vito trying to act by sending Luca Brasi to see the Tattaglias, for example, but Don Vito's moves are late and ineffective, and he becomes the target of the assassination outside of his business when he finds himself without protection, only escorted by Fredo, and we know that Fredo is completely ineffective, essentially useless in these kinds of situations. That marks the beginning of Michael's ascent to power, right? In the case of Michael, what is the first act that marks Michael's involvement in the family? And therefore, that would be suggestive of his own model of leadership within this kind of schema. What is the first thing, the first time that Michael takes the initiative establishing the start of his ascent to power within the family? What is that Michael does in the first film to get involved in the family affairs? The first step to his eventual rise to the top of the family. Listen.
He avenges his father.
Right? And where do we place this act? Force, right? It's a brutal assassination of both McCluskey and Sollozzo within inside the restaurant, and following that, Michael is forced to go to Sicily. Okay? So, from the beginning, we see Michael err on the side of force and violence within this schema, right? In fact, there are people inside the family who are against this plan, and they think that the plan should not be done simply not because they think it's impossible, but rather they think it would be too costly, right? So they see this in terms of business. They know that the assassination attempt was about business, not a personal thing. And what would be the cost of exacting revenge by killing a police captain? There would be a very high cost involved. Michael disregards that and proceeds with this double killing that takes him to Sicily. What kind of leader is Michael in Sicily? In the story, when he goes to Sicily. In Sicily, we see Michael traveling around, escorted by local bodyguards. Then he falls in love with Apollonia, love at first sight, almost. Then he goes to Apollonia's father to request his permission to see Apollonia and eventually to marry her. They get married publicly in a church with plenty of people in attendance. They go live in a villa where Michael was hiding, and Apollonia becomes the victim of a murder attempt against Michael when she drives the car where someone placed a bomb to kill Michael, at which point Michael will be called back into the United States because the situation is, his permanence is too risky for him now that his enemies know where he is. So what can we say about this interlude, this episode about the first marriage of Michael to Apollonia before he can marry Kay, because their marriage plans are interrupted by the events in Michael's family? During the episode of Sicily, do we see Michael use force and violence? No, right? Nothing of the sort. He's traveling with armed bodyguards, but he's not using violence or the threat of violence, right? No force, no deterrence. What else? How is he behaving like a leader? In what way in Sicily, if you remember the episode? What happens when he approaches the father of Apollonia? How does he implement his plans to see Apollonia, to frequent Apollonia and pursue this love relationship?
Doesn't he just say, wait to the father?
He's requesting permission, right?
Yeah.
But what else? What is he offering to his father? To her father, sorry, to Apollonia's father? No, not money, but something valuable, though. Instead of hiding his identity, or bringing power into the equation by suggesting that the father should follow his request, pay attention to his request because he's powerful, he does something quite different. Ludovica?
If I'm remembering correctly, he actually offered sort of like protection and showed respect to the family.
He shows respect by doing what? He hands power. He acknowledges the power, places even more power into the hands of the father of Apollonia. By doing what? By revealing that he is in a precarious situation. By telling his father, I am an American who's hiding in Sicily, and there are people who would pay to have this information. So it's clear that by revealing his identity this way, not by saying, beware, follow up on my request because I'm the son of this very powerful mafia mobster, is instead placing himself in the hands of the father-in-law, saying, I trust you with my life, and you should trust me with your daughter's life and fate and destiny. So clearly, Michael is trying to influence the decision of his father-in-law by acting in a way that is almost submissive. It's an exchange of trust. It's the creation of a circle of trust. However you interpret this, it is influence. You might say there is manipulation in this. Granted, there is a little bit of manipulation, but however you characterize this exchange, Michael is not using force or deterrence, but he's trying to simply convince the father right? Influence his decision. The father of Apollonia is supposed to voluntarily go along with his desire to entertain a relationship with Apollonia. Then Michael comes back, right? And we see Michael working with Vito, his father, to restore the power of the family. And we'll see how his father will be at a meeting with the other 5 families, the representatives of the major mafia families, to secure safe return for Michael. How do we place this attempt by Vito within this schema? What is Vito employing in order to make sure that no one will attempt to kill Michael while he's traveling back from Sicily, or before he can travel back to New York and find protection within the family, right? Be protected by their bodyguards and soldiers. What does Vito do in the meeting? And which category does that approach, strategy belong to? So Vito is at the table, right? So there is no violence, right? They're just having dialogue among mafiosi. And at the end of a conversation with Tattaglia, with the mediation of Barzini, Vito simply says, I'm a superstitious man. Should anything happen to my son Michael before he can get home, I will hold you responsible, right? So, clearly not influence. There is no voluntary response to this. It is deterrence because he's threatening. There is an implicit threat in his words. Meaning, if anything happens to Michael, even if it's hit by lightning, I will hold you responsible, right? Meaning, I will deploy force against you, right? So, it's not showing a gun, it's not threatening directly, but it's still a form of deterrence. And then Michael comes back and is instructed by his father about betrayal, who and how they will try to strike an agreement with Barzini, and how this should be handled by Michael. And eventually Michael, during the baptism scene, will have several leaders of rival families killed. Once again, we see Michael using force, right? Where is Michael using influence and manipulation in The Godfather Part 1? He's not really using influence and manipulation for the power side of his crime family, right? But he's still using influence and manipulation to a degree within his own family, right? A couple of examples of this. Where do we see Michael using influence and manipulation? On the side of his own family, not the crime family. Chris?
It's when he, the one that comes to mind for me is when he wants to get his wife the signature from Frank Sinatra character, because he knows that, you know, Frank Sinatra is in no place to refuse him anything because he's the son of Vito. But there's no threat of violence.
So,
it is
in the marriage scene, he's trying to influence Kay, right? Because he's not showing off, he's doing the opposite.
Yeah.
He's not pushing for Kay to acknowledge that he belongs to a powerful family. If anything, is playing the opposite game, and it's Kay who's more than eager to acknowledge that his family has power, right? So I would say brilliant definition of the use of influence by Michael in that scene. Where else is Michael using influence in relationships having to do with his family? Or manipulation, because we also have manipulation. When is Michael distorting, falsifying, or providing information selectively to influence the results, for example? Lisa.
I feel like when he comes back from Sicily, that and he reconnects with Kay,
Mhm.
that as if
How does he get her back into the relationship after she's seen plenty of violence in the story of his family?
I don't remember the exact dialogue, but I remember definitely
The element, even if they're not the word.
I feel like just, you know, like promising her, you know, that they're gonna be a strong family and then this.
Not a strong family, because strong could be
That's
suggestive
true,
of
that's
force,
true.
but rather legitimate,
Yeah.
right? He promises her that he has plans to make their family business a completely legitimate business, and therefore be integrated into regular society within 5 years. And in fact, in The Godfather Part 2, Kay says, well, you promised me that within 5 years our family would not have nothing to do with illegal businesses, and it's been now 7 or 8 years, something like that. So that promise has gone unfulfilled. So that's clearly manipulation, because it's providing her with selective information. Yes, he does have that kind of a plan. The withdrawal of information is that he knows that the path towards legality or legalization of their business is still a very bloody path, right? That will involve plenty of fights or wars with enemies, competing families, etc. Right? So clearly there is selective manipulation through the use of selective information. Where else is Michael manipulating Kay's reaction or response in the first film?
As you were saying, I remember at the end when she asks who killed Colonel, he just literally lies to her face.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because he needs to have her by his side. He knows that she's not the kind of woman that would react to force or deterrence. And it's worth mentioning because there are secondary characters in relationships. Johnny Fontaine is one example. Fredo is another example for the second film, where there is the direct suggestion that they should use force to control their wives, right? But in this case, it's just the use of manipulation to have Kay on his side and to keep the family together. Now, the second film comes in, and what is the second film communicating about young Vito Corleone and the first part of his life? Keep in mind that we're still within the genre of the gangster movie, which started with characters like the protagonist of Little Caesar, Rico Bandello, the protagonist of Scarface, being portrayed as natural-born criminals. People with a proclivity to use violence rather than find other solutions. So, in an attempt to change the profile of the criminal, The Godfather Part 2 insinuates the necessity for Vito Corleone to become a criminal. So we find Vito Corleone starting his life as a victim, right? Somebody who becomes an orphan, losing both parents and an older brother to mafia murders. We find him as someone who is brave enough to go by himself to the United States, and adjust to that situation. We find him enterprising enough to find a job in a store, in the store of Genco Abandando, and balanced enough as a member of society to be able to have a leveled relationship with his wife and start a family with her. And we see him as a caring individual with no criminal activities whatsoever. However, the references to the mafia in the early stages of his life, and then the intervention of Don Fanucci, the Black Hand leader of the neighborhood, represents the idea of necessity. Justify Vito's embracing of a criminal career because it's not his fault. It was not his fault as a kid. It was not his fault as a young man losing his job. And later on, it was not his fault when he moved from just being a petty thief to becoming a murderer and the leader of a gang after he killed Fanucci. He did all of that out of necessity, right? It was necessity to maintain his family that drove him to becoming a thief. It was necessity, the circumstances in the context in which he operated as a petty thief that forced him to kill Fanucci. That did not compromise his core identity, right? So much that he was able to be a doting husband, a good father, affectionate father. He was able to be a supportive member of the community, helping various people. Is it the same in the case of Michael? However, I feel that this is where I should stop to show you a few scenes to then support my analysis of Michael's failure or demise that will come later on. So we start this sequence. We're going to see the end of The Godfather Part 2. And just as a reminder, the sequence before the scenes that we're about to see in their entirety is the departure of the Corleone family. Vito, his wife, his 3 kids, they all went to Sicily from the train station of the village of Corleone, right? In here we get a final glimpse of Vito as a father who's very close to his sons and his wife as well. And that's important because after that we will find at the end of the film Michael very much isolated within his family, being feared by his relatives, and finding himself in a failing position because he has essentially abandoned almost the use of influence in favor of excessive reliance on force, violence, and deterrence, even within his own